Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fisherman's Post Saltwater Podcast series. This episode is titled Practical Summer Redfishing. I'm going to be talking with Captain Joe Tunstall, Carolina Traditions Guide Co., operating out of the Beaufort, Moorhead, Atlantic Beach area, and he is getting right to it. We're going to be talking about the what, where, when, and how, all the basics for finding summer red drum in a practical method. I'm Gary Hurley, your host. Fisherman's Post has been serving the saltwater fishing community since 2003. We've been bringing you fishing reports, fishing tournaments, fishing schools, membership content, and now back in our latest and greatest effort, the Fisherman's Post Saltwater Podcast series, where we reach out to our captain and guide friends from up and down the North Carolina coast and ask them to share with us their insights, their knowledge of how to catch more fish more often. And I am joined in this endeavor, round 2.0 of the podcast, with David Harden of Harden Creative Media.
Gary, how's it going?
David, it's going good, man. Good to be back. As I say, I think every time, good to be back in the podcast seat. Happy to have you here and very much looking forward to my conversation with, I'm going to call him longtime friend, Joe Tunstall now. I mean, I don't know what exactly defines long, but it seems like longtime friend.
Redfish, isn't that the state fish of North Carolina as a redfish?
Look at you. You did your homework.
I Googled it like a while ago, and I just remembered it right now.
I'm proud of you, Dave.
Thank you. I do homework.
This is just the effort I've been looking for. This is who I interviewed.
Minimal effort.
It is the state fish, man. It's one of my favorite. Joe's one of my favorite captains, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
You know what one of my favorite things is? Sponsors.
Man.
Particularly Port City Signs and Graphics.
I love Port City Signs and Graphics. Hey, I'm going to take the lead here on talking about them. I have used Port City Signs and Graphics since the company started when they were on Oleander Drive, and now they've moved to a bigger location. And it's because Sabrina Davis and crew are doing everything right. They're growing, and they're growing for the right reasons, man. I mean, they do banners, they do signs, they do leaderboard logos. You know, if you are a business, you want a relationship with Port City Signs, Sabrina, and the team she has assembled. What do you got for me there?
There's one of the signs they did for O'Brien Service Company.
That's a good looking sign.
Exterior illuminated sign. Looks nice.
See, I don't have O'Brien money. I haven't gotten a sign like that.
So, well, just be patient. Maybe she'll do one for you.
It's been 20 years.
This is the year.
If you were listening in the intro, I said 2003. It's been over 20 years. When do you think I'll be able to afford a sign like that?
Maybe just one more year.
All right, next year.
All right. Other sponsor, fantastic, Marine Warehouse Center.
Love those guys too. I mean, what a joy. The sponsors of the podcast, I actually consider friends.
I know, it's good. That's what's great about doing business locally.
Sales, service, and parts. Lately, Marine Warehouse Center has been helping me on the service end. The Fish Post boat has a few years on it, but those guys keep it running and keep it dependable. And I love Joel and the whole crew there, and Emmett and Terrell. And Terrell used to tell me jokes.
He used to.
But now he sort of like updates me on things happening in his life.
Okay.
Like if you remember last podcast, he wanted to tell me about his friend that got kidnapped.
Is that right?
Well, you were sitting there when I told you about it.
Oh, yeah.
But this time he told me about a mishap at home. He lost his wife's audiobook.
Oh, no.
Yeah. He said now he's never going to hear the end of it.
It's a good one.
Is it?
It's a good one.
Show me a video.
All right.
Matt with Marine Warehouse, excited to give you guys a huge update. We're now carrying Seabourn and Spider boat line. Of course, we have the newest models of Carolina Skiff, Sailfish, Sea Chaser, and Pan Marine. With over 60 boats in stock at a Wilmington location, let's schedule a sea trial and let's get you on the water today.
Good folks at Marine Warehouse Center.
Strong showing, man. I like it. I like that they do their own commercials there. And yeah, man, I like everything about Marine Warehouse Center.
And, if you know someone who's got a business that would like to sponsor the podcast, just contact the Fisherman's Post office and we will hook you up.
Yeah, you go to fishermanspost.com. We got information there on the podcast and really all the things we're offering. We got our arms extended in many different ways. And I'll use this opportunity to remind people that we also have weekly fishing reports, audio and video delivery at fishermanspost.com. You can check out more information about that. And being a member and signing up for those weekly fishing reports and forecasts, you can also have bonus podcast content and early release of these podcasts. So if you're a fan of the podcast, if you want to support the podcast, then you can sign up, access these podcasts 1 week earlier. And not just that, you can also access bonus content not featured in our public release on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
Lots of good stuff.
Lots of good stuff. Checking here. All right. So this is when we get ready to bring on our captain, our host, our guest of honor. But before we do so, Dave, a reminder, that we are coming back to you for David's best takeaway.
I've got my ink pen fully charged.
All right. And this is, I never told Billy this, but the only reason I created Billy's best takeaway was to make that guy pay attention.
That's right.
Because otherwise he'd be over there on his phone like a teenager. So this is true story. I created Billy's best takeaway just to make that guy pay attention.
That's good. Well, I'll be doing the same, carrying on the tradition.
All right. Well, it is now my pleasure to bring to the camera Captain Joe Tunstall, Carolina Traditions Guide Co. out of the Beaufort, Moorhead, Atlantic Beach area. Enjoy any time I get to talk with you, Joe. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing good, Gary. Had a charter today, near shore charter, looked some cobia and stuff like that, and come back and got my gear all ready because I'm excited about bringing back these podcasts, man. I'm fired up about it, dude.
Yeah, man. People have been, it's been a 1.5 year hiatus, and it is easy. Like say at the Raleigh Boat Show, it's probably the most asked about arm of Fisherman's Post, what we do. And yeah, man, I'm cherry picking you're on the cherry pick list, man. I wanted to call the captains that I, been wanting to do a podcast or do another podcast with. But as fond as I am of you, and I am fond, no one does the podcast without their 2 questions. You tell me you're ready, I give you question number 1.
Hit me up with it, man.
Why should we listen to Joe Tunstall talk about a redfish?
That's a great question, Gary. When you figure it out, let me know.
Nope, you don't get off of that.
I've been fishing the Crystal Coast my whole life. My family's native to the Tidewater region. Born and raised in Carteret County. Put my time in, as I like to say, from the water line to the wheelhouse, all the way up. And somewhere along the way, I just got absolutely fascinated with drum. Trout were a big subject of mine, but somewhere along in the quest, red drum from beginning to end lifespan just kind of became my fish of choice. I like to sight fish them. We're going to talk about practical red fishing here because that's really what everyone wants to know about, and that's the root of it is most practical style, and then you can build up from there. That's the foundation. Is practical fishing style. But anyway, I don't know why you should listen to me other than I'm passionate about it and I like to get people fired up about it. And I like to do it. And I've been catching redfish my whole life. And somewhere along the way, I just got really fascinated with them. And that's what I like to chase. So.
All right. That is a great answer. And I'm just going to go ahead and note you articulate son of a bitch giving me waterline to wheelhouse this early in the podcast, winning me over with your words. But you still have question number 2. And I think I've done a version of this with you, so you're going to have to forgive me. I'm recycling material at this point because I'm playing off a Carolina Traditions Guide Code. Now, I think I have a different Carolina Traditions questions for you. I'm going to give you some choices. You tell me which is your favorite Carolina tradition of these that I'm going to list. You ready?
Oh, boy. Hit me, man.
All right. Now, you got to answer. Don't give me a political non-answer. Cheerwine versus Pepsi.
Cheerwine.
Bojangles versus Krispy Kreme.
Oh, God, man. Krispy Kreme.
Are you sure?
He's more American, more North Carolina, man. More authentic.
Texas Pete versus Mount Olive Pickles.
Oh, God. You saved the hardest one for last, man. I'm going to pick Mount Olive Pickles because I can live without Texas Pete,
Well, that concludes question number 2. You are cleared for takeoff for this podcast, Practical Summer Red Fishing. And yeah, I like you have a very practical approach, as in what, where, when, and how. So I'm guessing we're going to start with what to use, and I'm going to get out of the way and let you take it.
Yeah, man. So what, obviously the biggest what, the foundation what is redfish. And we're going to be using a variety of different tactics, but all pretty simple. My number one tactic, and, we'll talk some more about this and how, is a popping cork and a jig head. Number two is, and it depends on the person, but number two, and I'll explain that later, would be a Carolina rig. Notice mine are pretty short here. That would be next. And then a gold spoon would be the next one. And then just a jig head and a soft plastic, and then an artificial shrimp. So those are going to be what we're going to talk about when we get into the, more into the how a little bit. But that's my number one practical tactics for red fishing. You're going to be, since this is practical red fishing, we're going to talk a little bit more. We're going to put a little more focus on natural bait or cut bait, because, when you listen to the fishing reports, that's the most consistent catcher on charters. And for folks that come down and have to make their weekends count or their time on the water count, natural bait is probably going to be the go-to for most people. This time of year, it's going to be starting to see some mullet. You might catch some bigger mullet. Mud minnows are always a good go-to. Crabs work exceptionally well, but the problem is they get chewed up real bad when the junk fish start to show up. And menhaden, peanut pogies, whatever, those are going to be another good common go-to bait for red fishing, trout, drum, all different stuff. And then you're going to have your shrimp. They're a little harder to keep alive, a little harder to keep on the hook, but shrimp always work really well. Really, you don't have to be too picky. That's kind of one thing that kills me about people selecting baits to live or natural bait fish with, is that they just get a little too caught up on the perfect size this or the perfect size that. I'm going to tell you, just like I like to say in my seminars, redfish don't live to be 50 plus years old because they're picky eaters. Redfish are very opportunistic, which this is one of the things I admire most about the species, is they're diverse. They're quick to overcome any type of obstacle. They go from out in the ocean, 100 foot of water, all the way up into the shallows with their backs out of the water, crawling through the mud. You don't even see how a fish could live and breathe in those conditions, and they're moving around back there. And let alone that, they're striving, they're eating, they're fired up, eating shrimp or crabs or mullet or mud minnows or gobies or whatever. So they're very diverse and have a strong instinct to survive. So don't get too micro focused on exactly what you're using. If you stop and throw the cast net and catch some pinfish and croakers and spots, that's fine. Put them on alive, but I'll be honest with you, right up until the pinfish, and even when they show up, I prefer to use cut mullet. I'll use cut mullet, cut croakers, cut pinfish. The mullet have an advantage because they're a little greasier. Mullet and menhaden put out more of an oil, and it boils down to scent with redfish. That's not always the primary thing, but scent does matter. The guy who makes AM Fishing out of Texas was privy to a survey in Texas about redfish and how strong scent is. So a dog can smell, I'm going to grossly probably throw terrible numbers out there, but say like a dog can smell 300 times better than a human, a redfish can smell like 1,200 times better than a dog. It's just phenomenal. It blew my mind. So when you're soaking bait with a popping cork or a Carolina rig, or putting the Procure on a shrimp or using gulp, when you're doing that, you're putting scent in the water. So it's kind of important, like especially for Carolina rig fishing, if you got a slick starting up and you see that slick, you want to put that popping cork or that Carolina rig back close to that slick that you created from whatever type of natural bait that you're using, because if you go back on a falling tide, and we're going to get into this some more with the wear, but when you get back on a falling tide, they're coming out of there, and that scent is present. So they're going to follow that scent right into your lure. So that's some of the what's that we're talking about. We're going to talk about what we're using. We know what we're targeting. And then that takes us to the where, which is the big ticket. Timing has a lot to do with that as well. But the where part will be any type of area that you like to, whatever you've got to target. So let's start out with intercoastal waterway type areas. And you'll hear this if you listen to the fishing reports with the different guides from South Carolina all the way up to the Virginia border talking when Gary talks to the guides. I like to sit and listen to them too, because it's good to know what's going on when I'm in the queue waiting to do my fishing report. But the guys who target the docks on the intercoastal waterways, a dock on a point is always good, or a dock that has 4.5 foot of water off the end of it on a low tide is good. Another thing that they don't talk about very much, but is important, is if you have some docks that have some sort of structure behind them, like an old rock bulkhead behind them that's submerged, or some of the docks along the area, they're not necessarily all on the intercoastal waterway, but there are some that have clam grass between the end of the dock and the seawall or the property boundary where it meets the dock. Like over by Harker's Island, we have a lot of those. You'll have a dock that goes out several hundred feet, and then you'll have, some of them have old rock bulkheads down submerged underwater. Other ones will have underwater grass that runs off because they don't have a hard impervious bulkhead. It's more of a natural bulkhead on their property. And so then those areas you'll have underwater grass, and those redfish will cruise around those docks and up in that grass. And those are excellent type of docks to target. And so that's aware is docks on the intercoastal or in your area, docks on points, docks that have 3.5 to 4.5 foot of water, even on low tide, especially off the end of them, docks on points that have current sweeping by them, or docks that have some sort of natural type structure between the end of the dock and their property line, like old submerged bulkheads or grass flats, stuff like that in there. That's part of the where. The next where is marsh bank edges, marsh points, marsh channels. So you have a marsh system like the haystacks, and you've got all these different creeks that run through that marsh, and some of them are deep and some of them are shallow. Obviously, those redfish will go up shallow, but if you're trying to sit somewhere on a boat, then if you're riding in on the incoming tide, you kind of ride up in there and kind of see how the current moves in there. And then if you're fishing on the falling tide, you would want to get up in there on the higher tide and kind of ride the tide back out. That will teach you a lot about an area, how the current flows out of there. And if you pay attention, you'll see signs on that bank. You'll have a steep cut edge, or you'll have a shallow side, and one side will be deep. You'll have points inside that marsh system. Some areas will be deeper than others. Those redfish can do any of those environments. They can do the deeper edge, the shallower edge. A lot of it just depends on the finer details of that area. They're going to have a lot of predators. Are there going to be a lot of sharks coming in there? Are there going to be a lot of dolphins coming in there? That will dictate where those redfish want to go. Do they want to be shallower, or are they comfortable being deeper? And another thing I talk about in my seminars, and I always love that old guy who laughs at me when I say this, but a lot of fish, trout, drum, they never lose the fear from above. Their entire life, they've had to be fearful of an osprey, an eagle, a pelican, a seagull, something eating them. And that redfish doesn't know he's 30 inches any more than my lab knows he's 85 pounds. He ain't got no clue, man. So they're always a little apprehensive of an attack from above. And if you don't believe that, go back into a marsh system that there's bait in and watch birds fly over. If I go into a marsh system I've never fished before, I watch for bird activity. That could be shorebirds like egrets, ibises, herons. That could also be seagulls, terns, stuff like that. Terns are going to target smaller bait and shrimp. seagulls are going to target whatever. It could be a French fly floating, they're going to eat that. But it's something to pay attention to. If you're consistently seeing that, then there's something there for them to eat. They're not just there getting a suntan. They're there to eat, and a lot of them are going to, especially shorebirds, are going to eat the same thing that a redfish is going to eat. And we've actually sat and watched them on charters, as the tide falls out of a marsh area on the flat side, the egret standing there on the bank in the mud, and small, like 10, 12-inch red drum swim, push the bait up to the egret. And then we watched them play one day, like, I don't know, it looked like they were playing. They went up underneath the egret's legs, and he got mad and went up and pecked at the redfish. It was very entertaining. My clients had a blast. But that was the first time I saw it. It looked like they were just enjoying being a redfish and playing. But my point remains is that, I teach this to all my clients on the boat, is that those birds are there for a reason. They're not just there getting sun. They're eating the same thing that those drum are. So if you're back in that marsh area or whatever, since we're talking about marshy areas, and you see that, if you see that those birds fly over the marsh, you'll see the water move underneath. And quite often I've gone in and keyed in on a group of redfish working in the back of a flat in a marsh area because of birds that just simply flew over top of that marsh basin. So if you can find all of the above, so we're going to talk, we've talked about dock structure, we've talked about marsh edges, so we're also going to look for oyster rocks and underwater grass. If you have all of those things that meet that criteria, then you have all the structure that a redfish needs. You've got marsh grass, oyster rocks, underwater grass, and then maybe you've got a few docks around there. I prefer not, to have to target around docks, but if you do, the more of those things that you can find and kind of start laying them out, the better off you are. And then there's multiple ways to target. You can target those points in those marsh areas, those deep cuts, and then you start keying in on where those oyster rocks are. A lot of times around the point, or if you got a large marsh system with a creek that flows into it, you'll have some oysters around the mouth of that cedar creek or mosquito ditch, something of that nature. A little oyster rubble at the mouth of it. It's just where they naturally collect when they come out of the marsh, and they'll stay there and grow. Those redfish will key into those areas as well. And you're in a pretty good spot, and especially if you have a good marsh edge, a creek, a mosquito ditch, or a cedar creek that comes out, and then you've got a few oysters at the mouth, and then some of the areas that I fish, you'll have underwater grass outside of that too. So find you a little bit deeper edge. I try not to use an anchor. I like using a stick-it pin. In my mind, if you got your chain on the anchor, that chain sitting there and you're moving in the water and that chain's clicking and clacking and tapping, sound travels fast underwater. Redfish have a very pronounced lateral line, and I even turn my sonar off when I'm backwater redfishing. I'll either put it on standby, turn the sonar off, or turn the whole unit off, one or the other. And a lot of old school red fishermen hardcore believe in turning that unit off when you're shallow water fishing. And a lot of that can dictate if you're fishing hard bottom or soft bottom. Hard bottom sound travels even faster. Soft bottom, it dampens the speed of that sound traveling a little bit. But anyone who's ever spent any time in the water at a creek or a sandbar or something, if you put your head underwater and you're snorkeling around, you can hear boats coming from a very long way off. Those redfish, I think, in populated areas learn to equate that with a threat. I don't think that they make the deliberate comprehension that, oh, that's a human coming to get me. I think they just associate it with a threat. They've been around for millions of years. Don't underestimate the survivability and the logic of the species. It's another thing that kills me about, a lot of different groups I speak to in charters is they just assume that they're all dumb. Something that's been around for millions of years might not have the logic a human does, but it figures things out very well. It has a strong survival instinct. So we've pretty much covered a lot of the wear type areas, marsh systems, underwater grass, oyster rocks, docks with deeper edges are on points. So let's talk about the wind. So I get a lot of debate, and that can depend on the different areas. A lot of people get hung up on this iconic, flood tide fishing up in the grass, blah, 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 yakety smackety hoopla. So that's great if you know an area real good and you've already got those fish patterned, or, you know, cruising around through the grass, poling, trolling motor, whatever is just what you want to do. That's great. And you can find fish that way. And I'll explain a little bit about that. But if you're going to do it for all intensive practical purposes, the falling tide is what you want to key in on. Because what happens, the simplest explanation of it is on an incoming tide, those redfish, if you're working a marsh area, a grass flat, oyster rock type environment, underwater structure, you know, if you're working those type of areas, those redfish come up and spread out, and they'll cruise in big packs. You may see 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 together, but they spread out when they come in on an incoming tide. If you've never been clamming on a grass flat before, then it's harder to understand. But when you've been out with the family or whatever, clamming on a grass flat with that incoming tide, those redfish come up into groups and then they spread out onto that grass flat. And then you look around and you might see 10 or 20. I mean, on an incoming tide, I have seen triple-digit redfish come up on a flat, but that's in exceptional condition. Most of the time, you're fishing smaller groups. Whereas if you come back on the falling tide, all those fish that have spread out across that flat or into that marsh area are going to fall back to the pinch points, the ambush zones. They're going to fall back to those areas in the troughs and such like that, and they're going to wait for the bait to run out of water and fall back into those deeper areas. So that's why, you know, you think if you follow the logic, that's why it makes more sense to come into an area at the top of the high tide, preferably an area that you've already scouted on low water, so you know that you're not going to get stuck anywhere. You've already kind of got an idea of the bottom, and you fall back on that area on the falling tide and target those fish at the pinch points, the mouths of those smaller creeks coming into the larger bays or coves or areas like that. And then you'll find a spot off of a point or outside of a creek to set up. You know, if I like to find a deeper marsh edge, and I'll go up there, I pull the bow right up, I stick the pin down in the marsh, and I sit right there. And if you can find like a point where you have a marsh point, and then you've got some oyster rocks that you can just cast to, that's really good. Now I'm talking about tidal areas in my zone specific, because it's a lot different fishing the Neuse River, the Pamlico Sound, areas like that. Windward points and stuff like that is better. Pamlico Sound, Neuse River, areas like that. My area, we've got tide. So you're working points that provide a leeward side, things like that, because those fish will come out with the tide and they may go behind the point and hang out and wait for the bait to get washed around. They're ambush, more of an ambush mindset. Whereas on the Neuse River, Pamlico Sound, the windward points, the redfish has the advantage. The bait gets disoriented and he just goes in there and feeds. So it's a different mentality when you're talking about tidal areas. So when we're going to say the falling tide, also all summer long, from now all the way through December. Okay, work on the same areas, and now we're going to get into the how. I started with that when I said pull the bow up. For example, the area I'm talking about, you have a marsh point. The deeper trough comes on the marsh point. You're kind of right behind that point. The tide's coming out around here, so that way you can cast out across there. And, you know, in my mind, the marsh point is creating a block for your boat. So you're not having to fight the tide as much. The waves aren't slapping on your boat as hard, things like that. That's what you have. And then you can cast, you know, preferably you've got the wind to your shoulder or something like that. And then we're going to work. My number one go-to is contrary probably to a lot of other guides who'll say the Carolina rig. I have a lot of reasons why I don't like having to use the Carolina rig. I'm not going to go into them because I'll eat the rest of my time up. But with the popping cork, buy a good popping cork, people. Don't buy one of them little craft store rinky-dink ones. These have polycarbonate beads on them. You got flexible frame here. You already got your sinker on here. When you set it up correctly, you got some barrel swivels. The only trick, if you'll notice, this is a 4 Horseman Pro Series. They take and twist the wire up in here with a haywire twist, And so if you tie your braid directly to this end here, the braid will get endlessly wrapped inside of this and it'll frustrate you to death. So what I do is I take a piece of 40 pound, I put a barrel swivel on it. It doesn't have to be picky. It doesn't have to be big or small. I mean, and I don't go any longer than the length of the popping cork. You'll notice that's probably about 3/4 the length of the popping cork. So then I'll tie my braid off to this barrel swivel here. Or you can put a leader on, but I don't usually do that. And then you run. The next question, I teach this in all my seminars. Captain Joe, I'm fishing in 10 inches of water. What do I need 20 inches of leader for? Because your cork's floating. It's a lever. When you pull on the cork, you're going to lift this lure up. You know, it's not like you're pulling a lure, you're dragging it across the bottom. Will it find snags? Yes, it'll find snags. Sure it will. But anyway, I'll run no shorter than 18 inches. I'll run 18 to 24 inches. Maybe on the Neuse River, I'll go to 30 inches or something like that. This is set up as an artificial with a jerk shad on it. But, and these are nicer hooks here. You don't have to use these, but I grabbed them because they're the size that I like. They're 1/8 ounce 4/0. The reason I like that 4/0, I want a good quality, strong hook because I've had them straightened out before. It doesn't have to be these. These are high dollar. I do like nicer jig heads. I'm not a big fan of the old gotchas and stuff like that, you know, but whatever. And I would explain that, but again, it'll eat up time, but I have a logic behind it. So I do prefer a newer, more modern, higher quality style jig head. I do prefer 4/0. I do prefer 8 ounce. Those are kind of, is it a must? No, it's not a must, but it is definitely a preference of mine. And that's what I'll put my cut bait on. And again, like I said, I don't focus too much on specific species of my cut bait, and I don't focus very much on size. I'll take 6-inch finger mullet, and by the time they meet those chicken scissors that you buy at the tackle shops with the blue handles or the green handles on them, it don't matter what size they are. Because I take and cut them up into pieces. You know, if I'm using a 4/0 hook, I'll put an inch and a quarter piece on there. Now, let me explain something to you. A redfish, a slot drum, doesn't seem to have a very large mouth. Now, once it's open, you can see that it's a larger mouth. But that slot drum will eat a 5 or 6 inch blue crab. No problem. He's coming through, cruising on the bottom. He sees that blue crab. He sucks it up. He goes into his crusher plates. He's got 4 crusher plates in his throat. Bam, breaks that crab in half clean every time. So you're not going to put too large a bait out there. What you are going to do with a larger bait is you're going to scare off some of those little turd fish. You're going to scare some of those little, the undesirable fish that you don't want to catch. You're going to scare them off, and you're also going to weed out some of those 14 and 16 inch drum. So you're going to be targeting slot fish to 30 inches, 35 inches. So I use that larger piece of mullet, cut it right up with the scissors or whatever you're using, pogey, whatever. If they're the smaller pogies, you know, a couple inches long, I'll put the whole pogey on there. I hook it through the gill plates because that's the hardest part of them. Toss it out there. If you're fishing for slightly larger drum and you got those real small pogies about 1 inch long, I'll put 2 of them on there. Doesn't matter. Puts more scent in the water. That bigger redfish is going to come around. He's going to eat it. And another thing about those bigger redfish, a lot of my clients have a very hard time leaving that cork alone. And they like having something to work and pass the time. That's great. You know, but as soon as that cork goes under, they give it some kind of big old Bill Dance hook set. That's not what you want to do. You want that cork to completely disappear. And then you'll just reel ahead and lift the rod tip as you reel. And really, if you keep the slack out of the line when you're fishing with a cork, whether it's artificials or live bait or cut bait, is the very most important thing, keeping the slack out. Because then when that cork goes down, he's already pulling against the cork and he's pulling your line. So it's pretty much a hook set. With a good hook in there, you're already getting a hook set. And another thing that I'll tell my clients and tell you guys is when you're fishing slot drum with the right setup and over slot, 30-inch, 35-inch fish, he ain't going to play with it. It's just going to disappear. It's going to disappear. I mean, you can leave it in the rod holder. Now, when it drifts not where I want it to, I will reel up and put it back where I want it to, but I also want it to cover ground. I want to throw from that point across the deeper trough to the other side or work around that marsh. If you got marsh that you can hit, and I want that cork to drift down and move down that marsh or move between those oyster rocks or move through that trough down the edge, because they're another name for red drum is channel bass. They like to move on the edges of contours or on the edges of channels. So working those edges is important, whether it's the edge of the marsh, the edge of the underwater grass, the edges of the oyster rocks, the edge of the trough going back into that marsh system. Those are important areas. And by fishing that cork, number one, you help keep your bait off the bottom so the crabs don't steal it as bad. You're covering more ground, putting more scent in the water. Your cork is doing what you have to do on a falling tide in 10 or 15 casts by drifting. So even if you want something to cast, make sure that you throw a couple of corks out there and just let them drift and put that scent out and let them call the redfish to the cork. That's what you want it to do. So that's really important, finding the right area, and it just takes some trial and error. If you know you're in a fishy spot, you might not be there at the right time. The wind might not be right. The tide might not be right. But if you're finding bait, you're finding birds, you know you got the structure, you know you're in the right place. Now, where the Carolina rigs, and really these are little Lupton rigs is what they are. But I just got where I don't like all that slack in there, and I like it closer to the bottom, because what's a redfish top thing to eat? Oh, I'm down. I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to run out of time, Gary.
You're doing great.
Anyway, so I use a 4/0 hook. I use 30 or 40 pound leader. This is 1.5 ounces flat. And the reason I use this is because I fish tidal areas. So when you use the round rolls around, and that drives me nuts. So I will use the round, but I like using the flat because it doesn't roll as bad in the current. Keep my beads on there, use my crimps. I use 30 or 40 pound leader because redfish aren't drum shy or leader shy, but redfish eat crab. So they want that lure to be kind of close to the bottom. I'll primarily use this in the Neuse River, to Pamlico Sound, or when I'm fishing marsh points or areas like that where I know I don't have any structure. And a lot of the guys will also take these setups and they'll pitch them up underneath the ends of those docks. You can use, that's kind of what this one's more set up for, 3/4 ounce. You can pitch that up under a dock and reel it back to you. You know, that's kind of what that's set up for. You can throw it on a good clean marsh point and let it sit. You can put a decent sized chunk of bait on here. You got a good circle hook. These have the barbs on them. You know, you can put a real nice piece of bait on there, and you can just leave it in the rod holder and let it sit. You can mix all these things up. And while you're doing that, you can throw a topwater plug. I mean, that's how I do it on my charters. You always got 1 or 2 guys in a group. They got the busy hands. So give them a topwater lure, give them a gold spoon, let them throw. But keep your baits out there and keep the bait checked on them, because that's the most important part. You don't want to be fishing on credit. So what you want to do is make sure that it's getting that drift, so it's sitting out there. And you'll know if there's a bunch of turd fish around, you'll see that cork bobbing up and down. You know, you'll see that going on. But if that's not the case, then you want to make sure you keep hitting what you think or know is the target zone. So you just wanted to get a good long sweep through that area and allow it to be able to put the scent out and cover as much ground as can be, because that's the purpose of fishing with the cork. Whereas with the Carolina rig, it's an area that you expect fish to be coming through, and you want to be able to have something on the bottom for them so that you're ready. And then that comes into your artificials or your popping cork with your voodoo shrimp on there, which these are 3.25s. I think this one's called Magic Grass. It's a greenish color, very good color for a lot of different waters. But I'll run that under the popping cork. And then another thing that I'll run, I don't use these very much when I am natural bait fishing, but I use them a lot that's what's on this with the jerk shad. These are backwater candy, 1/8 ounce popping popping pencil weight. And you'll notice it has a shaft weight, and then the eye comes up. So basically what you have when you're fishing the artificials is you can put your jerk shad on. You got a lot more grip down here on the frame, but this moves a lot like a natural shrimp. When you're pulling that popping cork and you're throwing up on those marsh grass edges and you pull this, it darts back and forth like a shrimp, and it goes up and falls down a lot more like a shrimp. So I've cut back on how many artificial shrimp I fish, and I mostly fish 5-inch jerk shad. These are Slayer 5-inch jerk shads, but great lure for covering ground. Got a little area in here, a little pocket that makes it swim good, but you can also load that up with Procure or your favorite scent of choice. All these are excellent covering ground baits for the type of areas that we're talking about. The only other practical thing I'll talk a little bit about is this before we get into recap. Gold spoons, great for covering ground. You can throw them up on marsh edges. Also spinner baits too. Throw them up on marsh edges while you're drifting down, keeping your baited corks up there. You got the busy hands guy who likes to throw something. Just retrieve it, and maybe about every fifth retrieve, pause it for just a half a second, pick it back up again. What you want it to do is you want that gold spoon to fall about 3 flutters down and then pick it back up. You know, a lot of people get, these have a great flash to them. These are the Aqua Dreams. They have a great flash to them, but I think it's as much about the sound of this spoon moving through the water as it is, the flash, which the flash matters too, I think sometimes, but the sound matters more. Before we get to the recap, I'll talk a little bit about popping cork strategy. I mentioned when you're fishing with those natural baits, you want to allow it to sit long enough to cover ground, but not so long that you're fishing with a piece of bait that has no scent or no piece of bait. You want to be constantly, when you stop and cast net, say you're going to cast net some mullet, you want to have 3, 4, 5, 6 dozen, because you want to keep changing out. You want to make sure that if you're coming in an area you believe is fishy, that you're giving it at least 20 or 30 minutes investment in that area. Sometimes you don't need that because as soon as the cork hits the water, it disappears. But you're also trying to farm that scent into that area, so you're calling those redfish to you, and that's important whether you're Carolina rig fishing or popping cork fishing. If you're using natural bait, you want to give it enough time to get some scent in the water in that area. If you're working artificials with the popping cork, allow it to sit, because these beads are making noise. You've got your leader, and then I tie a loop knot to all my artificials and naturals when I'm fishing the popping cork. So your cork's sitting there moving in the water, and your lure is moving like this. So you have sound, movement, a target, and then you can put some scent in here. So you've got all 3 things. So don't just, a lot of people I popping cork fish with, and that works sometimes, all they're doing is constantly pulling it to them. A lot of times that redfish will follow that and never commit, because he doesn't have to waste energy chasing that. When there's a lot of shrimp around, why is he going to waste energy chasing something he's not? So allow it to sit, sometimes 5 seconds up to 20, 25 seconds. Sometimes I don't pop them at all. They're just sitting there, beads clacking, lure moving. They're just sitting right there, and they'll hit it that way. I'll drag them behind the boat when I'm on the trolling motor. When I'm drifting down a bank, I'll drag something behind the boat, usually with an artificial on it. But allow it to sit, and then when you do want to retrieve it to you, retrieve it about every 2 or 3 feet, 5 feet, stop it. Let it fall back down again, then pick it back up again. You'll be surprised how many times that'll produce an eat for you by stopping that, pausing that lure, and allowing it to fall all the way down. And you'll know, because you'll see it come back up to the top like that. Once it does that, I like to say it's reset. It's reset itself. So then, pick it back up and move it again. But a lot of times I see a lot of people overworking these corks. You got to break down the dynamic of what you're using here. This is already, as simple as it is, a relatively complex fish calling device. Don't overcomplicate it. let it sit out there a little bit longer, and then every time you bring it to you, pause it and stop it. 2 more little things. The oval cork is the most consistent for me all year round, and it's the easiest to work. If you're going to make a bunch of casts and you're going to be working a marsh bank or something like that, you can make the most cast with the oval corks, and you won't tire yourself out. Whereas when you go with the concave cork, this little shot glass one, it's moving a lot more water. It's going to wear you out. If I'm soaking more bait, I can guarantee you I'm going to use this. Or if I'm seeing a lot of surface activity where I have a lot of predator fish feeding, because that concave section of that cork very closely resembles the inside of a redfish's mouth. That's pretty much what, in my mind, they're made to be. Because if you look at the top of the roof of a redfish's mouth, that concave aspect of this cork very closely matches that. So if I'm trying to get the biggest bang for my buck, and I'm going to allow this cork to drift edges, or I see a lot of surface activity, then I'll work the concave cork more predominantly. And there have been times, yes, where the concave cork will outperform the egg cork or vice versa. I've probably seen it where the oval cork will outperform the concave one most of the time. So I still had things I wanted to cover, but I believe I covered most of it. So how about a recap, Gary, on things you want to hear more about?
Well, here's what I'm going to say. As soon as you started, I thought to myself, man, this isn't one podcast. This is more than one podcast, but man, this guy is rolling, and I'm not going to I'm not going to get in the way of Joe Tunstall when he's excited talking about redfish. So here's what I'm going to have you do, man. I'm going to have you just give me your wrap up thought. I'm not even going to do any follow up. We are going to hit you up a little bit in the bonus content after following this podcast. But for right now, man, I'm just going to put it right back to you and say, hey, man, in a minute or two, close it up, man. Summarize what you have, and what's your final thought you want to leave people with. This is your podcast.
If you think you're in a fishy area, keep trying it at different times. You'll get there at the right time when everything intersects. Look for the birds, look for the bait. You'll get there at the right time if you have all the structure. Invest your time in that one area. Even going back, that's what I did. I had 2 or 3 areas I invested my time in, and I figured those areas out. Once I figured those areas out, I was able to apply that knowledge to new areas and say, oh, this looks like this area, or blah, blah, blah. You get the point. And I figured that out. So if you have an area that you can get to and hit, invest your time in that area, figure it out. Even if the catch ratio is not there, you can apply that knowledge to another area, and that's how you grow your spots and grow your knowledge. It's all an investment. We help and try to give you guys as much information as we can, but there's no cheat code to it. It still boils down to time. And the more time you can put in that area that you have to invest, the better off that you're going to be.
I think that's a great way to end the podcast, Joe, man. Thank you very much. A wealth of, I have a feeling that people aren't going to watch this podcast. They're going to watch it a couple of times, just because it's coming at them, in a fire hose.
Well, that's the good thing about the podcast is a lot of the clients I've had, that's why I just advocated for it all along, because they can get that podcast, get their little notepad, and they can play it back as many times as they want to when they get in the Gary Hurley Premium Club there or whatever it is. But they can play it back as many times as they want, and they make notes on it. And I'm not joking, Gary. I've had clients get on my boat that have a notebook, and they want me to break down the things from my podcast item by item in that notepad for them. I'm glad to do it, man. They're putting the time in. They're learning. I'm going to help them all the way.
Well, man, it's 100% chance we have you back, 100%. And I said at the beginning, man, I welcome any opportunity to talk fishing with my friend Joe Tunstall. Joe, thank you. I'm going to say goodbye. I'm going to do some closing remarks with Dave, and then we're going to reconnect.
Sounds good, man.
All right, David Harden. That podcast was for you, young man.
I'll tell you what, that was something else. I got a full page of notes that I made, just like Joe was saying. I'm one of those guys on his boat. There was so much information. It was fantastic.
So much, and you're the audience, like the person who gets frustrated, wants to catch a red drum, feels pretty accomplished in the realm of lizard fish, but wants to wants to put a red drum on the boat. I mean, there you go.
That's right. I know. I got so many good things. It's hard to pick one, but I know you want one.
Yes.
You want me to narrow it down?
Singular.
A singular. Okay. So the everything from the oval popping corks.
All right.
Okay. I don't have any of those. I'm going to get some now.
Do you have any popping corks?
I don't have any.
All right. So
I'm
yes,
like
you
a
need
Carolina
to do that.
rig guy. That's mainly what I use with Carolina rigs.
Well, you can still use those, but yes,
But
we
the
need you
popping
to buy
corks.
some popping corks.
Right. But I guess the number one tip I heard was you're attracting these fish by scent. So getting some smelly bait would probably be advantageous, like cutting your mullet up in big chunks.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm going with.
I think you have some good best takeaways. I think you've done a good job with your homework assignment this time.
Thank you, sir.
And I mean it, man. We're going to have Joe back. I mean, that was, as soon as he started, I thought this is at least 2 podcasts,
It's a
if not
Netflix
3.
miniseries, I think.
It is the Joe Tunstall miniseries. I
Yeah.
like it. Now you're thinking.
He could do it.
Now you're the idea man. I knew you were. Well, that's going to wrap it up, man. Let's do our closing remarks.
Great. Just wanted to thank our sponsors, Port City Signs and Graphics and Marine Warehouse Center. If you'd like to sponsor the podcast, just contact the Fisherman's Post office and we will hook you up.
Yeah, man. Again, Sabrina and crew at Port City Signs. If you have any sign needs, a relationship with them goes a long way. And I'm leaning in on relationship because that's what I feel like I have with Sabrina. And you've already heard me say that for years about Marine Warehouse Center. Man, and they're not just taking care of my boat. I've created a relationship with those guys, and that's how they treat it. And they want you in there. They want you to take care of you and have optimum time on the water. They get it. They get what's important to a boat owner. Optimum time on the water. Create a relationship with them.
Let's do it.
All right, Dave.
All right. Thanks for watching.